there that that happens from time to time. So, as a matter of fact, I have had to work very hard because I'm using my AirPods in my ears so that I can hear you better and not have all the noise around me. And so they're wireless, obviously. So I don't use them very often. So I have to make sure they're charged, and of course my computer as well. So technology is great as long as it has power and batteries. When it does not, or when it's not charged, it's not very helpful. So I get it totally, and that's just part of the challenge that we face in doing classes this way. Obviously, I would love to come to South Africa at some point, and we could be in person together, and we wouldn't have those challenges. But then we also couldn't make this as readily available either. So there's pros and cons to both ways. But anyway, as I was saying, and I will finish this um, before 8 o'clock, 2000 there, and then we'll take a short break, and then get into the book of Romans. I was mentioning the contrast between a tractate letter and what is called an occasional letter. Now, most of most of Paul's letters were occasional letters. And by occasional, we mean there was an occasion. So, it had a specific person or a specific issue, or both. It could have a specific person with a specific issue. So a tractate letter, general wide audience, like Romans, as I mentioned. If Paul did write Hebrews would be another tractate letter. You got a large audience, even though it may just be to one specific area, but you've got a just a general topic. um, Philippians, a tractate letter. You've just got a general idea to a general audience. Again, in Philippi, but no specific um, individuals. In contrast, then, to an occasional letter like First Timothy. Okay, First Timothy is written to a specific individual for a specific purpose. And so there's an occasion. There's an occasion that brings that about. Same way with Galatians, okay? While we don't know the specific people that Galatians was written to, it was written for a specific topic. There was an occasion that brought that letter to be. Um, we could say the same for Philemon. Philemon fits all the criteria for an occasional letter, a letter of an occasion, because it is written for a specific occasion to a specific person. It is written to Philemon to receive back Onesimus, who was his slave, who apparently had run away and been with Paul, and Paul had taught him the gospel, and he'd become a brother in Christ. And so the occasion, the setup, is very specific, and the person to whom it is right, to whom the writing is going to, is very specific. And so you read Romans 1 and verse 1, and the Bible says, uh, to Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through the prophets and the holy scriptures concerning his son, who descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit. Drop down to verse 7. To all those in Rome who are loved by God and called to be saints. Okay. So we're talking to the saints in Rome. But again, that's not specific enough to make it an occasional letter. You get to the book of First Corinthians, okay, we got some issues. You say, well, it was written to the church at Corinth. That's right. It was written to the saints in Corinth. That's right. Just like the book of Romans was written to the saints at Rome. I would have to agree with that. And so the the reason why the letters are different in their nature is not because of the of who received it. It's just as specific for Romans as it is for Corinthians, but the issue is different. Romans is a very general letter. It has a very generic topic, if you will. Um, the material within it is broad. You come to First Corinthians, which we'll talk about next week, Lord willing. You come to First Corinthians, and it is very specific. It has some issues within it that Paul is going to address very specifically to a audience within the church. And so I just want you to know that there are different, not styles, but different types of letters. And so even today, when you write a letter, the first thing you need to know is what's the purpose of this letter. In my position, if I might call it that, as a full-time minister, I'm asked to do a lot of character references. And I don't know if you know what character references are or not, but basically, people who go to church here come to me asking me to submit a letter to someone proving their character, proving who they are. And so the first thing I have to ask you is, okay, who am I writing this letter to? And what am I writing this letter for? Because I've done everything from writing a letter to a judge, trying to help someone get out of a charge that has been brought against them. I have gone to court to appear before a judge, having written a letter to that judge to try to explain, I know this person, I know their character, I know their behavior. I've done that, which is pretty big, all the way to writing a letter to someone who is trying to get a job, and I've wrote a letter to an employer. Okay. Well, if I'm writing a letter to somebody who owns a business that is looking to hire one of the church members here, that's going to be a different letter than writing to a judge trying to get someone who has been charged of a crime expunged or dismissed, or at least get them to receive a not guilty verdict based on their character. And so we write a lot of different letters. I write letters to colleges to try to get students into colleges. Would you please accept this student? They have a great character. They have a great work ethic. They have, blah, blah, blah. But it's a different letter. So we understand that, and we do that all the time. I just want to call your attention to the fact that these letters, and we'll go through them fairly quickly, but these letters are all in a different tone, if you will. And we'll try to point that out. We'll try to make note of that, and we'll try to highlight that as we go through. So just the idea of a tractate, a general letter, a wide audience. The book of Ephesians would be like that. The book of Philippians, I've already mentioned, would be like that. The book of Colossians would be like that. The book of First Corinthians, yes, First Thessalonians, they come into the occasional letters because of the occasion that is before us. Obviously, Timothy, Titus, Philemon would fall under there as well. So before we take a break here, any questions, comments, concerns with the overview of all 13 of Paul's letters? Well, let's take about a 9-minute break. I've got one after the hour. So let's come back at 10 after, take about a 9-minute break, and we will move into the book of Romans then. Everybody back? Everybody good? Good deal. All right. Well, let's take a look at the book of Romans as we start as we continue through the New Testament here. We having looked at the first uh, 5 books, Matthew through Acts. We come to Romans, and obviously we've already dealt with a few things here, so we can move through some of this fairly quickly and maybe spend a little more time on the themes and the purposes and such. When it comes to authorship, uh, we've already pretty well established that. Already read verse 1 of chapter 1. Um, Romans 1:1, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle. He pretty well does that with every letter. And so, again, makes it kind of easy for us. Um, I don't personally know of any debate against the authorship of Paul for the book of Romans. I'm sure if you search widely enough, you'll find somebody. There's always somebody who's going to, disagree or claim that. I mean, what they've got to claim is that I mentioned this back in my discussion with Bella about the councils and all, and the canon coming together. I don't remember if that was Monday or I think it was Monday evening about the pseudepigraphas, and that's just a big fancy word for somebody writing under somebody else's name. So they would have to claim that somebody did that. In other words, they would have to claim that I sat down or you sat down and we started writing the book of Romans, and when we started, we wrote, you know, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, when really we are not Paul. Um, I just don't know of any um, sources that have a good reputation that deny the authorship of Paul. That's just where I'll leave it. You know, there are books that are questioned. There are authorships that are debated. Um, it's just Romans is just not one of them. It seems to be pretty solid uh, on the authorship. Now, when you come over to chapter 16 and verse 1, Romans chapter 16 and verse 1, at the end of the letter, okay, or almost the end of the letter, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, to help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many and myself as well. Obviously, we've got uh, a sister named here. Um, it's obviously she's been given some titles and some uh, different offices and authority that is not justifiable. But what I do think we need to stop and just make mention of is that Paul is writing these letters, okay? So somebody's got to carry these letters. Remember, we have no email. Um, we, we have, uh, we don't have the ability to ship and send in a certified way. I could send you some certified mail, even. I could require you to sign to receive mail if the document was important enough and significant enough that I could know you got it and only you got it. I could even require you to have to show photo ID to prove your identity. Well, back in this day, okay, we didn't have all that. They didn't have all that. All right. And so obviously to prevent scams, which all the things we have in our world today, and we still have scammers, but to think about, okay, here I am, I've got a letter from the Apostle Paul. Well, that is a bogus email, right? That is a scam. Uh, this is not really a letter from Paul. Okay. You and I have checks and balances today that they didn't have back then. So we had to have some notation, some documentation. So that's what Paul is doing in chapter 16 and verse 1. Phoebe appears to be the carrier of this letter, if I could say that. Call her the messenger, call her the postman or postwoman in this case, whatever you want to call her, whatever, whoever carries the mail in South Africa, give her that title. Okay. And so it appears as though she is a servant who is entrusted with this letter. And somebody's going to have to be done that way with every letter. Because here's the deal. If Paul is in Rome, then he don't have to write him a letter. Just go talk to him. Or if Paul is sitting with Timothy or Titus, he don't have to write him a letter. Just talk to him like me and you talking. But obviously he's not with them. As a matter of fact, it is suggested, based on your overview that I gave you there a while ago, that Paul is actually in Corinth, not in Rome. Paul doesn't go to Rome till the very end of his life. He's going to die there in Rome, but he doesn't. He's not in Rome until much later, um, in his journey there at the end of the book of Acts. And so he's not there, so he can talk to him. He's not going there immediately, but he is going to send the letter there. And so who the letter is carried by matters. And obviously, though I don't know much about Phoebe, what I would suggest to you is that she must be well respected by the people in Rome. I mean, if you're wanting something to be well received and to be read as an official document, then you're going to send it by somebody who is respected and trusted. You're not just going to give it to, you're not just going to walk out of your house and walk down to the sidewalk and give it to just anybody and say, hey, would you carry this for me over, to the next country or down to the next city or whatever. You're going to give it to somebody that you respect, and you're also going to give it to somebody that they're going to respect. So the other day, talking about letters, the mail runs here every day through Saturday. It does not run on Sunday in the United States, but we have the United States Postal Service that brings mail 6 days a week. Well, obviously, I went home. It's lunchtime here. Well, it's going into the afternoon, so I went home to eat a bite for lunch. And on my way back, I stopped by my mailbox at the end of my driveway, and I pick up my mail. There's always mail in there, usually each day, and letters and bills. And my daughter's fixing to go off to college, so I got a packet of information today from the college that she's going to, and she's got to fill out a bunch of forms and do a bunch of documents like that. And so, stuff like that, which is important. But then the other day, my wife, the mailman comes to the door and he says, I need you to sign for this. I got a letter from the court that was you had to sign a certified mail. And so obviously the court sends that to me because they want to be able to verify that I've got it. And they're not going to just put it in a mailbox somewhere and it might get lost in the mail. They're going to make sure that it is handed to somebody in my house, and somebody in my house has to sign for it. So then I can't come back and say, well, I'm sorry I didn't come to court. I didn't know you wanted me to come to court. Well, we mailed you a letter. Well, I'm sorry I didn't get the letter in the mail. Well, this whole certified mail process takes that out because you have to sign for it. Therefore, it's verified. And so then if you try to say, well, I didn't get it, then obviously they catch you in a lie there. So thinking about the system we have in place, which is very elaborate, they had a system. It just, it wasn't the United States Postal Service. It wasn't the mail service, as it were. It was fellow Christians and people of respect and known to. So when Phoebe gets back to Rome with this letter, she says, "Hey, I've got something from the Apostle Paul here." And they're going, "Oh, wow. They trust her. They know her. She's proven herself to be uh, uh, trustworthy, reliable, a person of integrity." But then they also know Paul, and so though Paul hadn't been to Rome, he they know him. They know his story. They know what he's doing for the church in Jerusalem and the areas around Jerusalem and Asia Minor and all of that. And so they want to see what he's got to say. And so the author and the messenger or the carrier of the letter um, is significant to these letters as they're written throughout the New Testament. Date we've already kind of talked about. Um, in Romans 15, I told you we were going to try to read more of the text as we go through. So Romans 15 and verse 25. Romans 15:25. At present, Paul writes, however, I am going to Jerusalem bringing aid to the saints. Okay. So he says we believe he was in Corinth at the time, as we've already established, but he's going to Jerusalem. And he's already taken up, as he mentions, he's already taken up a collection, Romans 15:26, for the saints. Who was he taking a collection up for? He was taking it up for the poor in Jerusalem. So obviously he acknowledges the fact that he is going back to Jerusalem, coming from the city of Corinth. And so if you put all of that into the book of Acts, you're in the third missionary journey. Okay. In that third missionary journey, which took place from about 54 to about 56, and you're toward the end of it because you're coming back to Jerusalem. You've already collected, you've already took up the money from the churches that had collected them, and you're heading back to Corinth, or back to Jerusalem, excuse me, from Corinth. When you get to chapter 16 and verse 23, chapter 16, Romans 16 and verse 23, Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quiritus greet you. So, where is Paul? Well, Paul is at the house of Gaius in the city of Corinth. Gaius lived in Corinth. So that's where he is. He's preparing to leave Corinth, go back to Jerusalem. And so the end of the journey, so AD 56. Put it somewhere in that year, maybe 57, but put it somewhere in that year. As I look back to the Thomas Nelson publishers, this is the one that wanted it in the winter of 57. And honestly, that seems a little narrow, just a little bit narrow for me personally. But I'm good with late 56, early 57. I'm good with that time frame. As you think about the winter rolling from the end of one year into the beginning of the next year, so AD 56 to AD 57 there. When you come to the audience, again, these are just things that we want to mention by way of introduction. When you come to the audience of the book of Romans, you obviously have Rome. That's verse 7. of chapter 1 to all those in Rome. Um, the saints who are called and loved by God. And so, uh, obviously, we have the Christians. Um, there could have been, just a suggestion, several homes. Remember that the church would meet largely in homes at this point. And so we could be writing to several different home churches, as it were, there throughout the city of Rome. We're clearly writing to Jew and Gentile. So we have Christians of both nationalities. Remember, we've already said that uh, in this day and time, you were either a Jew or you were not a Jew, meaning you were a Gentile. So the church in Rome, the Christians in Rome, are not just one nationality. No, they are multiple nationalities. And so Paul obviously wants to travel to Rome. He makes that very clear. He goes through that several times, but he's not able to do that, at least not at this point. And the only way he's going to go to Rome is in chains as a prisoner because he appeals to Caesar. And he's probably going to spend the last 2 years of his life, Acts 28, probably going to spend the last 2 years of his life in Rome under house arrest, as it were, there. And so he is going to get to Rome, yes, but he desires to go there. But in the absence of his ability to go there, being things that were going on in his life, he writes them this letter. And obviously, he writes this letter uh, and he rebukes the Jews in a lot of ways, and he welcomes the Gentiles in a lot of ways. And then he kind of rebukes the both of them together in a lot of ways. And then he encourages them together. So we can't pinpoint one, the Jews are doing bad, the Gentiles are doing good, or the Gentiles are doing good and the Jews are doing bad. He has some negative things to say to the Jew and to the Gentile. And then he also has some very positive things to say about the Gentile and about the Jews. And ultimately what he does in this book is he's gonna kind of single them out a little bit, and he's going to kind of talk to the Jews a little bit, and then he's going to kind of talk to the Gentiles a little bit, and then he's going to kind of bring them all together. And when you get into what I consider to be the heart of the book, that would be chapters 9, 10, and 11. That's where he's bringing them all together. And that's a very difficult section of scripture. So, what I would say to you is that if you're talking to a person who hasn't been a Christian a long time, the book of Romans is not for them. Okay. Young Christians don't need the book of Romans immediately. Now, that's not to say that there aren't many wonderful things in the book of Romans. And that's not to say that many things can't be learned from the book of Romans. But from an audience standpoint, now, obviously when we're talking about audience, we're talking about who he directly wrote to. Okay. So don't let me confuse you here. But I'm extending it to give you some advice on who the audience needs to be today. And so if somebody were to come into my office and say, "Hey, I don't know a lot about this thing called Christianity, and I would just like to study more and I'd like to know more," Romans is not the place to start. Okay, you need some Old Testament knowledge. Uh, you need some basic Christianity salvation knowledge to be able to work through the book of Romans in a way that's going to be productive for you. I would say the same about Hebrews. I would say the same about Revelation. Okay. So I would not recommend somebody, hey, I'm thinking about reading the Bible. Where would you recommend I go and start my reading of the Bible? I would not recommend you go to Romans and start. Go to Matthew and get the life of Jesus. Okay. Go to Luke and get the life of Jesus. Or if you're not a big reader, and go to Mark and get the kind of the shorthand version of the life of Jesus. And then go to Acts and get the history of the church, and then start, you know, meditating upon some of that. And now we're ready to get into Romans. Okay. As far as a study standpoint. Um, when you get down to verse 16 and 17, I always like to mention key verses. Might should have already done this, but as I see it, the key verses to, or key passage to the book of Romans would have to be verse 16 and 17 of chapter 1. Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek or Gentile. For in it is the righteousness of God. It is revealed from faith for faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." Quoting from Habakkuk chapter 2 there in verse 4. And so there you go. The key verse, one of the key verses, quotes an Old Testament passage. Well, I know that Habakkuk was an Old Testament prophet, but somebody who don't know anything about the Bible, they're going to be, really confused, and trying to make the connection here. The righteous shall live by faith. Well, that was the message God was trying to get to the Israelites back in the day of Habakkuk, trying to stress obedience. Okay, now when you come into it with all of that knowledge, all right, boom, Paul is trying to stress obedience to the God of heaven in order for one to be saved, that is being moved by faith, through faith, to a belief that is active in faith and because of faith. And so those would be my two key verses, as you think about the audience who is receiving it, and as you think about the audience today. Let's deal with some purposes and some themes fairly quickly here, and then we'll close out class for the week. Purposes. Well, obviously, um, there are a few here that I included on your handout. Those would include concerns about judging. Now, as I said a while ago, he starts singling out some people. So in chapter 2, he's going to single out the Jews. Okay. Now listen to what he says in verse 1. "Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourselves, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. You're guilty, yet you're passing judgment on the guilt of someone else. Shame on you." And the Jews are being very critical of the Gentiles, of the Greeks. And he's saying, whoa, 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 whoa. You don't start judging them till you first get your own life right. Because you ain't got any excuse. You've had the Old Testament, you've had the prophets, you've had the law given to Moses. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on and on. You've had the promises, you've had the generations of teaching. These Gentiles over here, well, they're just doing the best they can do. And yet you're criticizing and condemning them. And so, again, you see there chapter 11, verse 18, you see chapter 12, a couple of verses in chapter 12 there. The concern is that you are judging in a way that is hypocritical. And so in chapter 11, verse 18, "Do not be arrogant," he says, "toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you." Now, chapter 11 is that end of that difficult passage. I mean, if you want to start a passage of scripture that is challenging to all students of the Bible, it's Romans 9, 10, and 11. And chapter 11 is the end of that, where Paul is writing about the he's using an illustration of horticulture. He's using an illustration of of a growth of agriculture and the whole process of grafting in branches. And he's saying that we've got a root here, we've got a natural vine and we've got a wild vine. And he's talking about a natural branch and a wild branch. And if time would allow, I could go much deeper into that whole illustration. But that's what's going on. And so he's saying to the Jews, you are a natural branch. You are on the tree first and foremost. And what God has done is he's grafted in. You know, you could take a branch and wrap it real tightly to an open spot on a tree. And if you wrap it up just right and you put it in tight, it will eventually, some at least, will grow into that tree. And so you could have the trunk of a tree to be one species while you've got this branch out here that you've grafted in that is a totally different species. You got it off of another tree somewhere. But it'll work because the root system will supply it through the grafting process. Okay. That's what's going on. That's my hour and a half seminar in 3 or 4 minutes there. And he says to the Jews, listen, who are you to be claiming some priority here because you're a natural branch when you look down and you see a wild branch that is bearing fruitfully just like you are? It's not you, it's the root, you see. And ultimately, God is the root, God is the trunk. And so God is the one who is supplying the ability to be fruitful in the kingdom. And what the Jews are doing is they're saying, hey, these Gentiles, they're not worthy. They're not deserving. They're not honorable. And Paul is saying, oh, no, 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 no. Wait a minute. They're just as fruitful as you are because they're grafted into the same root. And so don't you be prideful. Don't you be arrogant. You may have been on the tree longer than they have, but they have just as much right to be connected to the root as you do. And that is a very deep, difficult spiritual conversation, but it is very beautiful and it is very fitting. But it deals with, the concerns revolved around judging there. Another purpose of the book is the Jew and Gentile salvation thing, and I've just basically illustrated all of that with chapter 11. Okay, and so the Gentiles are now being given the opportunity to be saved. That is new because Jesus broke down the wall of division. God chose the Jews in the Old Testament. You can ask God why he did that when you get to heaven. I don't know why. I don't know why he chose the Jews. He's God. Whoever he chooses is his prerogative. But what we have to admit is that in the Old Testament, God chose the Jews. He chose Israel. He chose the family of Abraham. And he worked his will and his purpose and his way through that family. Now, there were ways that you could be proselyted into the Jews, even though you were born a Gentile. But at the end of the day, if you wanted to be God's child in the Old Testament, you had to be a Jew. And so you could see where a lot of God's children were just by birth. They honestly cared very little about God, sadly, but they were born into the right family. There were others who had a very obedient heart and a willingness to serve God, and so they could be circumcised and they could be brought into the Jewish ways. Either they came to know God through the creation, or they married into the Jews, and so you would have a lot of Gentile women who would marry into the Jews. Well, guess what their children would be? They would be Jew, and so that would be a great thing for them in the inheritance and in the lineage there, specifically the male children that they would have.
And so when you come to the New Testament, it's altogether different. Okay. The Jew and the Gentile are equal. The cross is for everybody. God is, you're no longer a child of God by natural birth, meaning just because you were born into a nationality doesn't make you a Christian. No, you have to be born into the kingdom. There's a difference there. And so salvation, being born again into the kingdom of the water and the spirit, now you're a child of God. And it doesn't matter what passport you have, because ultimately you're a citizen of heaven. And our citizenship is in the kingdom of heaven. And so the fact that I'm an American citizen and you're a citizen of South Africa, and this next person is a citizen of Egypt, and this next person, the ultimate passport that we need is the passport to heaven. And so it doesn't matter if you're Jew and it doesn't matter if you're Gentile. Okay. And so salvation is for all. And so that obviously carries with it the need for unity. Okay. And so this book stresses a lot about the unity of the Jew and the Gentile. Obviously, they had been separated for generations. And then finally, the purpose to just encourage Christian daily living. Okay. Um, as I go back to the outline that I gave you, and that the document that I sent over for the book of Romans, just looking at that outline, it's just 4 lines here. It's the introduction, that's chapter 1 through verse 17. And then the second area is salvation by faith. If you're just looking at the outline there, that begins in verse 18 of chapter 1 and goes through chapter 4. Then when you get to chapter 5, you get this idea of living by faith. And that goes through chapter 15. And then finally, in chapter 15 and verse 13. And then finally, you got some exhortations and some greetings. And those start in chapter 15, verse 14, and go through the end of the book. Well, that's an outline. Okay. That's a 4-part outline. I can outline it even simpler for you if you would like. Romans 1 through 11, doctrinal. Romans 12 through 16, practical. Okay. So, so obviously Romans 1 through 11, doctrinal, meaning instruction, teaching, commandments, how to, based on God, how to. In other words, how to be saved, how to be free from sin, how to live a Christian life in the sense of the commandments, the rules that God has given. When you get to chapter 12, verse and through verse 16, it is the practical, meaning it's not the rules anymore, it's what this is going to look like. So go live in peace. Okay. It's not a command to be peaceful. And it's not teaching about how to be peaceful. That's chapters 1 through 11. Chapters 12 through 16 are go live at peace. Go be peaceful. Go do the things that make for peace. And that's what we mean by practical. It is the daily walk. It is the daily life. Go live based on what you've been told as to how to live. And so, again, like I said, outlines can vary greatly. Some can be very extensive and some can be very simplistic. And that is a very simplistic one for me, but there's a huge break between chapter 11 and chapter 12. And so, if I was going to send somebody to the book of Romans fairly early in their study of Christianity, I would send them to chapters 12 through 15. Because the end of chapter 15, chapter 16, that's just the greetings and stuff. Okay. That's just the end of the letter. Chapter 12 through the beginning of chapter 15, that's where you get here's what living like a Christian looks like. And there's some pretty simple, practical application things to that. Okay. The first 11 chapters are very crucial to Christianity in the form of teaching and the doctrine that is there. And chapters 9 through 11 would be obviously the deepest part of that. When you come to themes, okay, obviously you can see from the key verses of verse 16 and 17 of chapter 1, one of the key themes is to live by faith. Paul's gonna take that theme all the way through, even as far as to Second Corinthians. He's going to say, "For we walk by faith and not by sight." That's essentially Paul's motto. Faith is a huge topic of Paul's. He talks a lot about belief. He talks a lot about faith. He talks a lot about how important it is to walk and live and serve God through the faith that you have in God. He also talks about in this book salvation. Salvation, as he presents it, is by faith and not by works. That doesn't mean that he doesn't talk about um, activity or actions or things that a Christian should do. But be careful with what you call works, because there are those out there who claim that baptism is a work. No, baptism is not a work. Baptism is an action that results from a conscience that is convicted. Baptism is the process by which conversion occurs, where one is immersed into the blood of Christ. Paul talks about baptism in Romans 6. So, so if you, for those people out there who say that baptism is a work, and Paul says that salvation is by faith, not by works, Paul absolutely does. Paul says that we are saved by grace through faith, Ephesians 2. It is not by works. So if baptism is a work, then why is Paul talking about baptism very extensively in Romans 6? Because Paul don't believe in works. At least that's what they would claim, you know. And so they would say that when we have to do something like be baptized, then that is a work. And therefore we are saving ourselves, not God saving us. Well, that is terrible theology. Terrible. We are not able to save ourselves in any way possible. We are fully dependent upon God to save us, and we must have the faith that is necessary in order to move us not to work, but to obey. Now, when you get to James, James is going to use the word work to say that faith without works is dead. And and many are going to say, well, Paul and James don't get along. Well, yeah, they get along perfectly. It's just that Paul is not going to use the idea of works, but he is going to stress the idea of action. Paul never teaches a salvation of passiveness. Paul never says, you go be saved and do nothing. Never. Paul never says you can be saved by doing nothing. He never says that. He says right the opposite. And so, yes, salvation is by faith, for without faith, right, we must believe to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And then a final theme here, or I just kind of put two together, is righteousness and judgment. You know, judgment works to bring about righteousness because it's in judgment where justice is. And Paul talks about a lot. He uses the word justified a lot. And obviously, justified, some well-known, a well-known family in the United States in the members of the Lord's Church is a last name Winkler. And the Winklers have written a book on the book of Romans, and they entitled it Just As If I Never Sinned. Justified. That's how they define justified. Just as if I never sinned. And so there's an element of judgment in that. And what judgment brings about is righteousness because I can be viewed by God as though I never sinned. How? Through salvation. How? Through faith. How? That is moving me in obedience to recognize that it is not me, the branch, it is God, the root, that provides, that supplies, that offers, and that gives salvation. And that's the book of Romans in a nutshell there, uh, concerning purposes and themes and who this book is written to. If you want a passage of scripture to deal with this whole idea of faith and living by faith and the justification, if I were to tie all the themes together and try to illustrate all them together, it would be Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 4 talks about being justified because of faith and the salvation that is offered because of the justification that is offered. And it goes back to Abraham, talking about how faithful and obedient Abraham was. And obviously, he's leaning heavily on the Jewish audience at that point who would know Abraham and who would have a great aspiration to be like Abraham. So, with that, there's book 6. Next week, Lord willing, on Monday, I've sent the handouts over for next week, so hopefully you have those. If not, you get them by Monday. First and Second Corinthians will be on Monday, Lord willing, and then Tuesday's a big day: Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians. We'll try to cover all 4 of those books and give them a little bit of justice time in those 2 hours on Tuesday, and then Wednesday, Thursday we will deal with First and Second Thessalonians. And if we don't get done on Tuesday with those 4 books, we could carry over into Thursday. But it is my desire to get us through Second Thessalonians and then let Brother Jeremy pick up with First Timothy and take you through Revelation. So, questions, comments, concerns before we close in prayer tonight?
No, I'm actually grateful. I was one of those people who was confused with this whole concept of being justified by faith and then faith without action as being regarded as dead, just like James put it. So I think I understood I wouldn't say the difference per se, but how complementary these concepts are. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. I really struggle with people who put Paul and James contradicting each other. And I think it's a matter of terminology, and I think it's a matter of understanding that good works do not save you. That is a fact. That is a biblical fact. But if you are saved, you are going to do good works. You can't not do good works. If you truly appreciate and value your salvation that is only in Jesus, you can't live life and not do good. It's just going to be the nature of who you are. And so if you're not going about doing good, then you probably need to check your faith, because your faith is probably not what it needs to be. And truly, faith is the core. It is the foundation. But if you lived only in a foundation, y'all are sitting in a room right there. You are sitting on a foundation, but you've got walls, you've got a roof, you've got doors, You've got windows. I mean, I can't see the whole dwelling place, but I can see enough to tell that you have something over your head, you have something around you. You're not just sitting out on a foundation. If faith is the foundation and that's all you have, imagine trying to live on just a foundation. You're not going to be very comfortable. You need the walls, you need the roof. That's where the faith is put into action, and you're using God to build walls and to build a roof over your Christian life. It doesn't ever take away the fact that the foundation that is there is faith. But I can't see the foundation of that home that you're in right now, but I'm confident it's there. Because if it wasn't there, that wall behind you would be falling. Because it can't stand without a foundation and under it. And if you didn't have a proper foundation, my warning to you would be get out of that house and get out of it quick. In the same way, even if you have the proper foundation, that is faith, but you don't own it properly. Like if I was looking at that wall behind you and I was seeing big gaps in it and I was seeing it leaning and different things, I would again warn you, get out of that house. It is not safe. The foundation may be perfect, sitting on may be perfect, but there's dangers above you if it's not built properly. In the same way with Christianity, you must have that foundation that ultimately gets covered by the house. That is the faith. The foundation is the faith that is getting covered by the life. I don't mean covered in the sense that it goes away. I mean, it is built upon. You build walls, you build a roof in order to protect and to guide and to secure your Christian life. The foundation's still there. The works, if you will, are the walls and the roof that is built upon it. Any other thoughts before we close tonight? Well, let's have prayer together, and I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday evening and weekend. Hope you have a great weekend, a great Lord's Day on Sunday, and I will look forward to being back with you, Lord willing, on Monday. Again, you have my email, so if you have any questions, concerns, needs through the weekend, send me an email. I will respond to that as quickly as possible. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we're again so grateful for the day, thankful for the time and for the opportunity, and thankful for each one in the class, Father. Pray you will bless us to understand your word, to desire to study it more. Give us clarity in that understanding so that we can use it to help ourselves to be better, to live more like Jesus, and to help others around us. Father, dismiss us now in your love and care. Give us a good night's rest, a good rest of the day here. And may we always seek to serve you in everything that we do. We ask this prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you for the lesson.
Thank you for the lesson.
You're very welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Brother Rodney. Thank you.